So in 2012, I took a group of people to Everest Base Camp. It was a group of parents and children, so dads and daughters and mums and sons. They were mostly from St. Mary's, St. John's, Kingsmead, Rodin, schools like that in Joburg. And we took, okay, so Nepal Base Camp, Everest Base Camp, it's a trek, 60-kilometer trek, one way, 60 kilometers coming back, so 120 in total. Just to give you a scale, the blue line is the Everest Base Camp trek. The orange line that you see is if you would hike the amphitheater. The green line is going up Table Mountain on the Platteklip Gorge side. The red line at the bottom is the Otter Trail. So just to give you a scale of base camp, because now this is over distance and altitude is really the thing, because altitude is an absolute game changer. You know, it's like walking in thin air like this is imagining you walking up a flight of stairs with somebody's hand over your mouth, you know, and you just cannot breathe, or you're trying to breathe through a straw. It's very difficult. You move really slowly. You cannot believe how slow you walk. And in order to combat the effects of altitude, you have to drink a lot of water. You've got to walk slowly. I mean, there's 8 different aspects to consider, from little things like don't get ill, wash your hands, watch what you eat. So if you get a tummy bug, you're out of it immediately. There's no time to recover. To drinking a lot of water and eating all your food, and you know, like just walk very slowly. So we had a guy called Billy, and Billy's son, Billy was about 50-ish, just over 50 at the time, in Joburg, and his son was in not King David. What's the other David school? There's King David, and the other one, Coral, there in Ilovo.
King Edward?
No, another. It's another David.
Saint David.
Yeah. I think he was in that.
Saint David and King David.
Yeah, I think he was in the. I don't think they were in the. Yeah, they were in. Anyway, they were one of those schools, and he had a daughter in. Bianca was, I think. No, not I think. Bianca was St. Mary's. So Billy's son was in matric, and he was one of those students who was head of the chess team, head of the hockey team. You know, he was like Ducks kind of material. He was like just performing on all levels. And his wife opened the door the one morning to his room, and Stephen, the son, Stephen, the boy, was dead. He died in his sleep. So, I mean, their whole life then, you know, was affected, as one can imagine. So about a year and a bit later, Billy contacted me and said he wants to come to base camp with Bianca, his daughter. So Bianca at that stage was 18, and he wanted to come to just deal with Stephen's passing away, because, you know, Billy is like, he's like a pragmatic, come on, let's get going and work, and, you know, don't sit on your bum. You must get on with it kind of person. So he went straight back to work, and the work people, you know, probably said the right things, but he didn't grieve properly for Steve, you know, with Stephen passing away. So he wanted to come to base camp to deal with this loss and to connect with Bianca again, because, you know, he sort of felt, you know, they drifted apart a little bit. And then at the same time, his wife's twin sister, Liz, who is in London, who lived in London at that stage. And Liz had survived breast cancer, so she, you know, had her own, she wrote a book called Storm in a Teacup. So she had her own challenges, and Liz came along with her son that's more or less the same age as Bianca. He was a little bit older. I think he was about 20. So we were a group of 18 people. Billy was one, Bianca was one, Liz and Liz's son. So off we went. Now, I knew about this. He told me about Stephen. So Billy's name is Alan, but his name is Alan, but his nickname is Billy. And, you know, in the story I wrote, I made the mention that he looks like a Billy. You know, he's short and squat and stocky and chunky. You know, he's a lekker person. You know, he's just, you want to sort of just walk alongside him kind of person. So he and Stephen shared Liverpool football, red, you'll never walk alone, that kind of material. So he sort of mentioned it in passing, and we went on to the base camp trip. And this "you'll never walk alone" is, in a way, a metaphor that I don't know how it fits, but it just feels like it needs to fit into this story, into Billy's story, because they shared red, they shared Liverpool, they shared a love for football, they shared sport. And Liverpool is all about, you know, you'll never, I mean, that's their slogan. And he, you know, he's a staunch supporter. So we went to base camp, started walking. And so on one of the first or second day, I always walk in the back. But he didn't train properly for the trek. So he thought a couple of games of squash is going to do it for him. Anyway, so he mostly was, you know, in the back somewhere. And I walk in the back always. I walk with the last people. So the one day we're going up this hill, and I thought, you know, it was just the two of us, and he started talking. You know, we're just chatting away, you know, making small talk as we were trekking. And it came on to Stephen's passing away. So I said to him at one point, I said, "So do you still talk to Stephen?" And he said, "Yeah, you know, when I stand over a putt at Modderfontein and I'm putting, and, you know, I think of him because we used to play a lot of golf together. Yeah, so yeah, you know," and he was like sort of casually, you know, acknowledging that he still have conversations with Stephen. Anyway, we carry on walking, and it was before lunch, and we approached our tea stop. So lunchtime, we normally stop, you know, 1 o'clock or 12 o'clock or so. We stop for lunch somewhere in a tea house. And then after that, we carry on to our overnight spot. Liz came running out of the tea house because she saw us coming up the hill, and she came towards us waving. And I came up to her, and she said, Coral, you'll let her in there.
Yeah.
Liz just said, she pointed inside and she said to me, "You're not going to believe this." So we went inside the tea house. Now a tea house has got a central dining area with normally a stove in the middle, and tables where you eat your breakfast and lunch and dinner, and then a tiny little kitchen somewhere in a corner, and then rooms or passages leading off to rooms where you now sleep. It's like a little lodge. It's very basic. It's built of stone and, you know, plywood and glass. You know, it's very, very basic structures. But you sleep in a room with a bed, and there's this, you know, you take your own sleeping bag. And so, inside this room, normally there's expedition flags and photographs and, I mean, scarves. You know, people decorate these rooms, and it's nice and cozy and warm, and it's a beautiful space to sit in there. I've got a photograph. Hang on, I think I've got a photograph of a tea house. No, I don't. Okay. Next time I'll show you a photograph of a tea house. Okay, just put a pause into what I was telling you. This is Kathmandu, and the moment you land in Kathmandu, we go to the Bagamati River on the first day, just to get a feel for the culture we're going to move into. And these are open cremations that happen on the river, on this Bagamati River. So on your first day after you arrive there, you go there, and on the left of the screen, in the back, there's two bodies getting carried into the pyres, the cremation sites. So when you stand there, you see this happening. You see a body being put onto the wood, and you see the fire being lit, and you see the bodies burning, and you see that they call them doms. You see the doms stoking the fires and then eventually sweeping all the ash into the river. So, you know, this thing about life and death, and it's in your face. You smell it, you see it. It is for some people it's disturbing, but it is arresting. It grabs you, it touches you, it absorbs you, just this sight. So immediately you put into this space. So conversations around what the hell is going on here and how do I make sense of my suffering immediately gets shoved in your face and contextualized, because you now look at this from your vantage point, which, is, everybody's got their own vantage point, but this is it's a very gritty, stark, confronting environment. Okay, so we do our trek. If you look on the picture on your right, the guy in the middle of the bridge with the red cap on, that's Billy. You can see him there. So we arrive at this tea house, and Liz came out and she said, "Come, you won't believe this." So we walk inside, and where our group was sitting, there were flags, expedition flags. And above the table where we sat was a flag in red and white with names of the expedition members written on the flag. And Stephen and Ellen was written on that flag. I mean, I'm getting gooseflesh telling you the story. We couldn't believe this. It's like we didn't even discuss it. We just looked at, here's a flag above us. Probably they were English, I don't know, red and white. Maybe they were from Britain. But there was Stephen and Ellen written on this flag. And 15 minutes or half an hour previously, I had spoken to Billy and asked him if he still talks to Stephen. And he said yes. And here is this flag. Okay, so, and we sort of looked at it and, did this with our, don't know what to happen. Yeah, okay, amazing. Wow, Stephen is still here, kind of thing, and moved on. So we carried on with the trek and didn't make too much of it. About 6 days later, when we reached base camp, Billy had systematically over time not looked after himself. He didn't drink enough water because he had a thing about locking doors. So he always locked his bedroom door from the inside. So when you drink a lot of water, you pee a lot. So you need to go to the toilet at night, a couple of times. And he didn't feel like that kind of admin. So he didn't want to do that. So he didn't want to get up to pee, so he didn't drink water. So the result is he dehydrated in a big way. So when we got to base camp, let me just get another picture on the wall. So this is the kind of stuff that you see on the trek. Everything gets carried up. There's not a wheel in sight. There's no bicycles. There's no motorbikes. There's no cars. For this 60-kilometer section, everything gets carried up by porters, over the bridges. That's what that's the environment you walk in. It looks like that. There you are. This is us leaving from Kathmandu. Billy is the guy on the left here with the blue shirt and the jacket. Bianca, his daughter, is second from the left. She's standing there. And Billy is bottom on the left-hand side. You'll see he's got his cap on. Okay, so systematically over time, Billy dehydrated. We got to base camp, and this is where we are at base camp. So there they got the St. Mary's School thing. Billy is standing, you can spot him on the right-hand side with the Liverpool scarf and the Liverpool cap. So the scarf, the cap, he even brought a Liverpool pillow, and was in memory with Stephen, because he was taking Stephen with him, and because he and Stephen shared Liverpool. So that day, so we got back to, there's a village called Gorakshep that after base camp you sleep in a place called Gorakshep, and we got there, and I carry an oximeter that I measure everybody's oxygen and saturation levels twice a day. And Billy's saturation levels have dropped to alarming levels. It was below 70. It was 68 or something like that. It was terrible. I had such a fright. So we immediately, there's oxygen. You can buy oxygen on you buy oxygen $100 an hour. So we bought him some oxygen, and he was in his room, lying with the oxygen. And there's two kinds of injections. So I'm gonna give you a bit of a side story here. There's two kinds of no, let me tell it this way. So mountain sickness escalates in steps. So you get normal mountain sickness. So mountain sickness is nausea and headaches and maybe a bit of vomiting. You have advanced mountain sickness. Now that's when vomiting comes in, your eyes start to get swollen, you get like road maps in your eyes, it's like, bloodshot eyes. And then when it gets to an extreme or an advanced stage, you get a pulmonary or a cerebral edema. So basically your brain swells up, from the physiological effect of the air pressure and lack of oxygen, or you get water on the lungs in layman's terms. So it can either be in the lungs or in the head. And Billy had it. Now, as I'm telling you the story, I don't know if it was his lungs or his head. I think it was his lungs. Anyway, there was a lady who went with us, Winnie, and Winnie had injections for cerebral and pulmonary edema. So what you do in that stage like that, there's an injection you can give, and you need to give oxygen, and you need to get out of there. But now this was dark. It was like 8 o'clock at night. The choppers don't fly in the dark. We had to wait to the next morning. But Winnie said she's got the 2 injections. So now Liz is a nurse. She's a qualified nurse. So when I took his oxygen levels and I saw he's in a desk, I said, okay, now we have to, so let's go to your room, take you to your room. We'll bring you some soup there. We'll bring you oxygen, but let's also do the injection thing. So when he came and said, got the 2 injections. And so Winnie, what was so amazing, she thought it good to translate the instructions to Afrikaans. So she took the little papiertjies that you get with the medicine and with the injections, and there's that you let in the guide, Carol. She translated it all to Afrikaans. Now we're sitting in this room. Liz she can't read and speak Afrikaans. I mean, it's dark. I can't see properly. Winnie is not the nurse, so she can't really administer the stuff. Now, the 3 of us sits on this one bed. Billy's lying across as Liz told him. Liz said, "Come, move on your side, turn to your side." She took out a Cokie pen, put his bum down, made a circle like you can imagine in a movie. Bianca is standing at the door. My Nepalese colleague, Mohan, is standing, watching. So we're all in this tiny little room. Billy's lying on the... And he makes a comment, and Liz just said, "Shut up, Billy. I'm busy here. I'm going to give you an injection. Lie on your side." And she makes the mark. And now we need to decide which injection to give, because we can't give him the wrong one. And we're trying to make sense, but we figured it out. She gives him the injection. And that night we took turns, every hour somebody would come and check on, I would go and check on him. Somebody, Bianca would go and check on him. Liz would go and check on him. And, through the night, we just let Andre in. Through the night, we sort of took care of him. And the next morning, the chopper came and he was flown out to Kathmandu. Okay, so we were sad to see him go, but he's off, he's going to the hospital. So now about 5-6 days later, we're back in Kathmandu. We finished the trek, finished base camp. We walk back, fly to Kathmandu. We arrive normally in Kathmandu, we stay in a district called Tamel. It's the area where, where Westerners normally stay, when they do trekking and hiking there. It's an area full of pubs and bookshops and coffee shops and trekking shops where you can buy kits and equipment for trekking. It's a vibey, beautiful, congested, dusty, smelly place, but beautiful. It's like the place to be in Kathmandu. So we arrived there, and Billy, he says he wants to tell me something. So he wants to tell me what happened when he arrived at the hospital. So yeah, so the 2 of us go and we sit somewhere, have a coffee, and he said, they flew me. The chopper landed on the top of the hospital, and they took him inside, and he was sitting on a chair, waiting for the doctor to see the doctor. And the hospitals there is not quite like our private hospitals, but it's proper hospitals. It's a bit smaller, and those doctors know all about altitude, and you're in really good care when you're there and there's a situation. So Billy was waiting, and he said, while I was waiting, across me was flower, was a vase with a flower in it. He said it was across me was a vase with one red flower. And he said, when I came out, the flower had wilted. And I mean, I couldn't say anything to him. And he just said, Stephen was there. You know, Stephen was with me. And so so I'm telling you this. So there's a part of me that I don't understand those things. But for Billy on this trek, got confirmation that Stephen is somewhere, it's around, even if it's just in his mind. And it had a effect on him. So the extent to which he dealt with his grief, made peace with us, and moved on, I don't really know. But he has given me enough clues to suggest that he has constructively dealt with Stephen's passing away. I spoke to Billy about a week ago, 2 weeks ago, just to check that it's okay that I tell his story to everybody. And he told me that since I saw him last, which was, 2013, I think we saw each other the last time, his wife had sadly committed suicide. Because after Stephen's passing away, she couldn't deal with it, and she went into a depression, and she committed suicide. Bianca in the meantime, Bianca has qualified as a medical doctor, and Billy has found a new partner, and that's Billy about 3 months ago. So you'll see him and his new partner. He's still into the Liverpool mode. And there at the bottom right, he's with Bianca. She got married, and she's doing her internship in Stellenbosch. So, so Billy's story, I thought, so how do I make sense of Billy's story, and how do I, okay, so now I'm sharing you this, and so let's now find a confluence with what happened to somebody in real life, and how they dealt, in their own messy and gritty way, dealt with trauma and sadness, and how would that translate to what Frankel has to tell us. So, I don't necessarily, I can mail this to you, but for me, Billy didn't go to base camp. He went there not to try and get away from his grief. I think he wanted to make sense of it. He wanted to close it down. He wanted to figure out, how am I going to live with this loss meaningfully? I think that was sort of a attitude, and it ties back to what Frankel tells us about our search for meaning, that we want to make sense of all of this, and whether through the lens of what is important to me, significance or coherence. How does it make sense? How do the things happening in my life, how do I find coherency in everything that's happening in my life, and what is the purpose, my purpose, and how does purpose look in all my life? So he was dealing with that thing. So I don't think he was trying to run away from anything. He was trying to make sense of it, and how to figure out, how do I move forward. Love for me appeared in this thing, because he went with his sister-in-law, he went with his nephew, he went with his daughter, and he went with the functioning part of his family dynamic to deal with this challenge, and everybody was affected by it. So love and relationships was pretty much part of his agenda. He didn't go alone. He didn't go and climb some mountain all on his own to try and deal with this. He took his daughter with him, so that was significant. I think the failure of I'm calling it modern mourning. That was for him in play. He went back to work. he just had to get on with it. And, you know, he couldn't sort of, I don't think he said so. He said he didn't mourn properly. So for me, just this whole thing of, you know, how does this suffering look? How do I deal with it? How do I find my own dignity in it? Was questions that he still had. You know, he chose to take Bianca with him because he lost connection after her. So he still recognized his responsibilities in life. It was not all about him. It was also about Bianca, and, you know, so he was aware that there was, you know, a bigger responsibility that he had. So the mountain for me is, I mean, that space, and I think that's why personally, so I mean, everybody, you know, we're all unique in our own way. I resonate with India and Nepal because those environments are just so alternative. They're just so gritty. They're just so far removed from what we know and what we're comfortable with. And for me, from a transformation, to affect transformation, I resonate with that environment. Some people do it differently. You know, we all have our own styles, but the mountain, the thin air, the non-negotiableness of I'm in thin air and you're going to die and you better get on the chopper now and get out of here very quickly. Otherwise you also dead. I mean, that kind of, you know, you can't read those stuff in books. You can only experience them in order to find value from it. So for me, that was in play. You know, I think the defiancy coming there, you know, he was, like I say, that he's wounded but not defeated. You know, so the defiancy of the human spirit is we are so, you know, able to deal with toughness. And, you know, I saw that in Billy here. You know, Billy, again, it's a bit repetitive, but he didn't go for himself. He wanted to find something deeper. The red flower, and the poster or the flag in the tea house, that red flower, it was like a sign, you know, and where it came from, I don't know. I'm not going to try and, I can't argue it. I can't justify it. I don't have a clue, but it was there and it meant something to him. So this, you'll never walk alone. I mean, that is another layer. You know, he and Stephen shared the whole Liverpool thing. It was, you will never walk alone. And he got these cues and confirmation that you are not alone. You know, he could see the support that was around him. Yeah, so I think Billy, he didn't try and get over Stephen. He tried to deal with Stephen. So yeah, so that was Billy's story. Are there any comments or questions? Please ask questions or make some comments. It's just me talking here. What do you think? What do you think of Billy's story?
Classy, I think if one is going to face death or grieving, that a place like Nepal, the Himalayas, from all the factors that you've described, including that first slide you showed of the funeral pyres, it's far more, for want of a better word, it's far more accessible than it is in the West.
Yeah.
I think it's easier in that environment to be closer to the idea of death, to the reality of death, as opposed to here. There's less of a gap between the two somehow.
And
not just the funeral pyres, but as you described, how vulnerable we become. We become physically vulnerable, which then becomes spiritually vulnerable, and vulnerability, I think, allows the space for things to come to us in a very profound way. So irrespective, even if he'd gone there just to go on a trip, I think it would have been very hard for him to avoid confronting something like that.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. 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 You've been there, so
Yeah.
you've experienced that environment as well. Yeah. 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 And the thing that I think that in that environment, so we arrived there. Now I've taken people from Christian and Jewish religious orientations to India and Nepal, and the inclusivity with which they embrace different points of view is unique. For me, is unique, is remarkable. And in that recognition of differences and tolerance for differences, some people get strengthened in their orientation. Yeah, and some people see new ways of looking at life. I mean, I walked into in the early days. I was in Delhi, and I walked into one of the restaurants there. There was a picture of Ganesh. So Ganesh is the deity with the elephant with the many arms. I mean, that's the Hindus. If there's any Hindu people here, please correct me. I'm gonna simplify it for my own benefit. They would say God is so special. Everything. God is in everything. Some religious orientations say you can't say his word because he is so special. You can't even say his word out loud. Some say he's everywhere. So the Hindus say he's everywhere. So they have multitude of deities. So there was a picture of Ganesha with all, the elephant with the arms, and Jesus on a cross. And I said to the guy, "What's with this? How does this work?" And he said, "No, it's everybody's welcome. We're all here, and Jesus was here." And it's like, they just so welcoming. So they got a way of dealing with serious, what we treat it solemnly and seriously, and obviously with respect. I don't mean any of this in any manner of disrespect, but we deal with it in a certain way, and they deal with it in a certain way. And there's no respect lost in the way in which they deal with it. But they just make it so easy to consume, and they make it so easy to talk about death, And so yeah, it's I think in that, against that canvas, as you said earlier, one sort of stand, you can face these things, maybe I don't know if easier is the right way, but you can face these things differently than when you're here. Yeah, so Billy's trucking along. I want to go and say hello to Bianca.
Can I just say a few things quickly? Can you hear me, Marcy?
Yes.
I don't believe that you have to go to the mountains. I think obviously the aura of the mountain can certainly facilitate grieving. But I have been in hospital wards in children's hospitals, and this was a long time ago, not like now when parents are allowed to be with children. And the children have taken me on journeys of their dying and who's there to accompany them. And that's been in a stark ward. So to me, I have never, ever questioned the fact that we die alone, because I have seen again and again and again that we don't die alone. There's always somebody or something to accompany us, no matter what the religious belief is or no belief. It's always astounded me how little children can take you on their own journey.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sue. Absolutely. Yeah, you don't have to go to the mountains. It happens in many places. Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes the mountains are in ourselves, and
Absolutely.
that's what we have to climb ourselves.
Yeah, so true. So true. Thank you.
That's an amazing story. Thank you, Classy. Let me turn myself off.
Yeah. I think it's like, I think, well, you're going to think I'm making this up. That red flower, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Anyway, yeah. I don't want to retell the story, but it was very special. It's very special. Thanks for listening. So if there's no more questions, I'll send you these notes, Coral, and if anybody wants to have it, yeah.
Thanks, Classy. And again, thanks for sharing that story.
Yeah.
Yeah, very special. We really
Okay.
appreciate.
All right.
Thanks.